Hi there, everybody. I am Leslie Nunnery with Teach Them Diligently Convention, and I am very happy to be hanging out today with Carol Barnier of Sizzlebop. She will be one of our featured speakers at all four of events this year. So, Carol, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Carol, before we get started too much, would you tell us just a little bit about you, how you got to where you are, how God put you in a position to minister to families the way that you do?
Well, I would love to tell you there was this thought out, prayed over plan, but the truth is I went into homeschooling kicking and screaming, and then I gave birth to this extremely distractible child, and that was just not the game plan. I had sent several memos to God about how this should go, and apparently he did not get them. So I've got this kid, and he struggled. Well, he flunked kindergarten. I don't know if that's possible, but he did not make it through kindergarten very well. And we went to each of the public schools. I was going to put him in public school. We were just kind of yuppies. We were just following the typical expectations. And every single teacher, we had four options. Every single teacher said to us, this child will not be able to function in our classroom unless he's medicated. And I'm not necessarily anti-medication, but in his situation, we couldn't do it. He had other medical issues, so it was just off the table. We couldn't do it. So we ended up homeschooling because we didn't know what else to do. And we thought, we'll do this until we figure out a real game plan. And, God has such a sense of humor. If we'd known all that would be involved, I probably would have run screaming from the room because I thought homeschoolers were like, they lived in Idaho and they raised goats and had 14 children and baked their own bread, and I knew that this was not me. So I did it sort of on a temporary basis, and it was so extremely successful for this child that we never looked back, and we have homeschooled all of our children ever since. And I think we're hitting about 20 years now that we've been homeschooling. So that's how we got started.
Wow. Now, how many children do you have all in?
I'm speaking to homeschoolers, right? So I have to say the words, I have only 3. I'm so sorry. I know that if you have 6 or less, you have to include the word only because nobody cares. So yes, I have just 3 children. Their ages now 25, 20, and 13, almost 14.
Wow. Now, I know that your son was a highly distractible child. Did any of your others struggle with similar temperaments?
Yes, I would say out of the 5 people in our family, including my husband and I, we have one child who is what is called neurotypical. The rest of us are all a combination of ADHD and just a variety of alphabet soups. But ADHD in 4 of us and only one who's not. So we all struggle with it.
Okay, well then, before we jump into really looking at children and looking at all that God has taught you in dealing with children, how then have you worked on discipline in yourself, and how are you able to accomplish what you are if you struggle with the same highly distractible nature as well?
Yeah, I've got to tell you a funny story. I was speaking at a conference in Virginia, and one woman walked through the hall with me, and she said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe that you can write books and homeschool and that you're really distractible. I just think that that's not true." And the director of the conference was walking behind us, and she came up and said, "Oh, yes, she is." So, I mean, I really am kind of the Lucy Ricardo of homeschooling, and it's not just something I'm putting out there as a publicity thing. I really live in that kind of distractible lane. There are 2 things that I have figured out. One is I have to be ordered in certain ways in order for my school to work, and I've written a lot and talked a lot about that. What are the things that we have to do in order to have some kind of semblance of order? But here's the second thing I've discovered. I've become less and less structured the longer that I homeschool. And what I found is I've developed what I've started calling rabbit trail education. And that is, if an idea hits me or something strikes my children, we will go off of our lesson plan and follow it until they're no longer interested. And if that means we suddenly spend 2 weeks studying, mushrooms out in the wild or something interesting that we saw in art or in history or whatever, we will go with it. Now, that used to put me into a panic when I was a new homeschooler, thinking, oh, the lesson plan, now we're behind, and I really started to panic. But over the years, I thought, it's interesting to me. You would think that would lead to a very disjointed kind of childhood, a disjointed kind of education. But I made this interesting discovery over the years, is that it actually pulled everything together. If you extrapolate an idea out long enough, eventually it comes around and it attaches to something else that they already know. And so I liked that we would strike when the iron was hot. We will follow something. I call it also delight-driven education. And it sounds like unschooling a little bit. It's really not. I'm really pretty structured. But I'm fully willing to let my children be thrilled about what they're learning. And it all ended up connecting in the end. So I guess I come at it from both ends.
That's fascinating. Well, I know that your business or your publishing arm, your ministry is called Sizzlebop. And I have never known why. So can you give us some insight as to why you chose Sizzlebop? What is behind that?
Well, it's actually a weird little story. You know, these kids tend to have like so much energy and they're bouncing off the walls, and they come, and you end up saying things to a child like that I'm telling you, I don't think regular parents ever say. And we created this wonderful contest in Sizzlebop called I Can't Believe I Said That. And it's just stuff that we said it. And parents will say things to this kid like, I mean, I actually had to say, I would lean over and look in the dryer and say, finish the chapter you're on and come on out because it's time for lunch. So I started collecting the crazy things that we said. So, okay, so why is it called Sizzlebop? I mean, years ago, my son must have been something like 8, and he's 25 now, so you get an idea how long ago it was. He came running up to me, and he goes, something really bad happened, and it was so serious, and it involved broken light bulb glass and smoke. And I thought, okay, I think that qualifies as serious. I'm with you on this one. So I go with him and go off to see what happened. And I get up there, and sure enough, there is a lamp. The lampshade is off, and there's this light bulb, and a portion of it is missing. And so I look around, and about 10 feet away, I see this little piece of broken light bulb that was lying on the carpet. And I thought, just the laws of physics alone here, how in the world did all of this happen? So I'm looking at this little piece of glass, and I noticed what looks like kind of a, I don't know, a dried piece of liquid or something that was on it. And I paused, and I said, son, what happened to this light bulb? And he got really, really serious, and he looked at me, and he said, perhaps when I was speaking, a piece of saliva might have been expelled from my mouth onto the bulb. And so I'm thinking, okay, you know, my first thought is my son's talking to light bulbs. We may have a bigger issue here. But then I noticed I'm looking at this piece of glass, and it is covered with little dried rivulets of something. And then I'm starting to figure it out. And I said, son, tell me, have you actually been spitting on this bulb? And he looks at me, huge eyes. He's just afraid to say anything, but you can tell the wheels are turning in his head. And I said, all right, we're going to try this again. Son, why were you spitting on a light bulb? And then he just kind of hung his head, and he said, because I liked the sizzle. And I just burst out laughing, and I thought, you know, okay, now there's a danger here. I've got to deal with that. But I just thought that was the funniest thing. And I thought, sizzle, I mean, that so defines this child and these kids. They like to see the sizzle and hear the sizzle and, frankly, be the sizzle. It just kind of really, I think, is a good moniker for them. So when I was trying to think what to call this group of moms, you know, this group of homeschooling moms who were dealing with kids like this, I thought about there's a dance of life that goes on around these kids who sizzle. And so they are the sizzlers, they are the sizzle in our families, and the bop is just sort of the dance of life that the family has around this child and around each other when you add the very unique rhythm of a sizzler. So that's where the name came from. I mean, it's got a long history.
That is awesome. Now, I was putting together the Nashville schedule yesterday, and I noticed that one of your sessions is something to do with don't miss the gift of your child or don't miss the gift in your child. And I don't want you to give away exactly what you're going to speak about because everybody needs to come to Teach Them Diligently to hear that. But I loved that title. And I think it follows so neatly with that story about Sizzlebop because it was that beautiful gift of your child that created this wonderful story and this wonderful ministry. So can you tell me just a little bit about the don't miss the gift of your child?
Yeah. That was actually the first talk I ever gave where the conference came back to me and said, that needs to be a keynote. That's a bigger idea. Everyone needs to hear that. But I thought, originally I was giving the talk for parents who have one of those sizzlers because they're hard. They're tough kids. They're challenging. And I'm not going to pretend that they're not because I've had one that's easy. I know the difference now. I remember so many times, and I share a lot of my talk, so many of those wake-up moments where I realized I had gotten so bogged down in the challenge and the difficulty and the discipline and the daily maintenance of homeschooling and the maintenance of this child, and I was so stuck on those things that I lost sight of the beautiful gift that this child was in my life. And I had to purposefully see this child as God sees them. Because if I didn't make an effort to see them that way, I saw them as the world sees them. And it's not nice. I mean, far too often people would say, well, that's just sin, or that's just, bad discipline, or that's just, and they didn't understand what was going on in this child's life and in their mind and in their brain and in their energy level. And God had given him to me for a reason. I was supposed to have the discernment of when it was willful and when it was something else. And I ended up realizing many, many things that we could do to maintain the view that this child's a gift. So that's kind of a peek at what the talk is about.
Well, that's awesome. And I've written several times as I've talked about you in the last few months, talking about you coming. This summer you spoke for us at a marketplace event in Little Rock. And after your session, I don't even know which one it was because I wasn't paying that much attention, but I have never in my life seen an entire room react the way that that room of people reacted to whatever talk it was that you gave. And David and I knew at that moment that your message was so important to families and was going to be so well received. We really had no idea. Now, you talk a little bit about the fact that it was really difficult on you to get started. Yesterday, as luck would have it, someone wrote on our Teach Them Diligently Facebook wall saying, this was my first day, it was awful, it didn't go as planned, I forgot stuff I didn't plan, we were sick, we didn't get through it all. Tell me it gets better. So for those that are just starting, or for those that aren't just starting, that are just still mired in frustration, tell me about how you started and the frustrations that you had and how it can and does get better.
Well, I'm impressed that she's already looking for solutions after one day, because it took me 6 months of misery to lift my head up and go, okay, this isn't working, we're going to look for something else. So I'm just really impressed. But I would also say we're all going to have bad days now and then, so don't throw in the towel too quickly. The biggest mistake I made that a lot of new homeschoolers make is we tend to duplicate in our homeschool the public school model. And that's where I went. So I went home and I put together this little public school in my house, and I had cute little antique school desks. Actually, it looked kind of like a Laura Ingalls Wilder, kind of a cross between Norman Rockwell painting. I mean, it was just a beautiful place. And I had tons of school books, and I rang a school bell. I'm not making this up. I rang a school bell, and I made them call me Miss Teacher, because I thought they're going to get confused. When am I mommy and when am I teacher? So anyway, I had this little public school at home. And for some reason, it hadn't occurred to me that the very reason I had pulled this child out of a regular school environment and brought him home was because it had not worked. I mean, we were really struggling with that traditional model. So 6 months down the road, I thought, we're going to kill each other. I mean, it was horrible. There had been so many tears. And I finally sort of, in a sense, I gave up, but it was a good give up, because here's what I did. I finally said, that's it. He is not able to learn with what I've been doing, so we're going to set all this aside, and we're just going to learn in whatever way he can. Now, at the time, I was still so married to the public school model. In my head, I thought, he's going to graduate from my school with a deficient set of academic and life skills and abilities, but at least we won't have killed each other. So it was amazing at that time when I threw everything else out and I just began experimenting, and we had fun and we learned. I mean, our schooling just exploded. It began to thrive. He began to learn. It all began to work. But it took that breaking point for me to let go of that old model. So what I would say to this mom is, if that model works for you, fine, go ahead and use it. It's all right. But if it doesn't, the wonderful thing about homeschooling is you have a bazillion choices. You have so many options out there. That public school model, maybe it makes sense if you have 30 kids and one teacher in a classroom for a single day. Maybe that model might work. But you don't have to follow that model at home. And so the rule is, if it works and they learn, you do it. That's what you do with it at home. It's very, very different.
Well, I assume then that since you have all of this experience and you are a published author on the subject, that you have figured out, at least to a certain degree, how these distractible kids learn. What is the secret for helping these young ones and older ones learn and progress and mature and all the things that are needed for growth.
You know, there is a secret, and a lot of times parents don't want to hear it, but here's the amazing secret. They need to move to learn. They simply cannot process new information unless they are in motion. And again, going back to that old model, here I was telling my child, sit down, be really quiet, put your feet flat on the floor, put your hands in your lap, fold them really in, and look me in the eye, and now we're going to learn. So when you tell that to a highly distractible, particularly ADHD child, they will implode. You know, you might be able to get them to sit there and look you in the eye, but they are looking all the way through the back of your head on the wall behind you, and they're staging, you know, World War III in some way. They're not listening just because you can get eye contact. So what I discovered is, once I realized that they needed to move to learn, I accepted that and I kind of let them move. Well, then that was my second mistake, because if you let them choose the motion, they will do something that is either really annoying to everyone in the room or destroys your furniture, you know, something like that. So I realized I've got to choose the motion. I've got to give them something to do. And I began collecting types of motions that this child can do that will keep them focused and keep them kind of present so they can hear the teaching that I'm doing. And I actually came up with a theme on what kind of motions they have to be. They have to be mindless and repetitive, mindless and repetitive. Because if it's a mindful movement, they get caught up in whatever the movement is, and then you lose them that way. So then I just came up with tons and tons of those things. And that's definitely one of the biggest things that changed our homeschool.
Well, how then have you come up to put motion to all of these different subjects, spelling, math, history, and so on? How does that work? What does that look like?
Well, okay, let's start with math. That's a really good one. I had this child would very often open up his math workbook, and it was math that he could do. I knew he was capable of doing it, but because he would see 45 problems on a page, he would freak out. He would melt down, and he just couldn't even get started. So I took the book away, and I would just take scrap paper and cut it up into small pieces, and I would give him one problem at a time. So now he's doing the math work. There's nothing changed here in this process. He's actually doing the math and writing it out. But if he got it right, he got to crumple it up and throw it into a basketball hoop that we kept over a wall in the kitchen. So that's a simple way to add motion to math. Then you can also, here's another of my favorite, if we were studying times tables or addition facts and things, I would take my kids to the park. I'd have my son go to the top of the slide. I would hold up 5 flash facts. He had to give me 5 answers. When he got 5 right, he'd go down the slide, whee, and he'd run back up and do it again. So he's learning his math, but he's in motion, and there's a mini reward attached to doing it. One of the newer ones I discovered, if your kids play Angry Birds, I thought this was kind of fun. I saw where a mom had taken some boxes that were supposed to be the buildings, and she just assigned numbers to each of the boxes, and she had some Angry Bird stuffed animals, and so the kids had to launch them from a distance, and however many boxes they knocked over, they had to add up the columns, the numbers that were on them, or maybe you had some kind of multiplication thing. But anyway, there are ways to put motion into math. Okay, let's talk about spelling. That's one people don't think about because they think spelling has to be copying the words down over and over and over again. Well, okay, let's take the pencil out of their hand and just try some other sensory ways of writing. You can put a little bit of shaving cream in a Ziploc bag and you squish it all around, and next thing you know, they're kind of writing in that. It's a very different textural feel, kind of changes the game up, and they may pay attention. But if they struggle with writing, you can just take Scrabble tiles. Lay them out on the table and give them their spelling words, and they just arrange the tiles. So now they've got motion involved and they're not writing, because writing can be a real struggle. One of my favorites, we have a deaf relative. We all had to learn sign language a couple of years ago. So the first thing you learn when you learn sign language is you learn the finger spelling alphabet, the ASL American Sign ASL alphabet. And so any kid can learn that one. And I would have my kids practice their spelling by finger spelling, because it's very, very kinesthetic. And if they struggle with writing, this was another way of getting the pen out of the hand. So anyway, it's those kinds of ideas. There's a million things like that you can do to keep them moving in some way, but still focused on their lesson.
Wow, well, we got a question yesterday, another one, and I'm just going to read this one because it's not my question. So, okay. But this mom would like to hear typical expectations for an 8-year-old highly distractible boy. Examples. When I give him work to do independently, how can I help him be more successful in completing those tasks like chores, schoolwork, etc.? After 2 big sisters, they're having quite the learning curve getting used to this highly distractible boy. So what would you say to this mom who this is a total curveball for her?
Yeah, a kid like that, I mean, I know for my own son, for years, even when he was doing his work independently, he wanted to be almost surgically attached to me. So, you know, I mean, if he were working on something, I'd bring him into the kitchen so that while I was cooking, he was actually still there. There was something about my presence that helped him, you know, get back on task and back on task and back on task. But one of the things I will say is you do have to accept that this child may truly forget. It is not necessarily behavioral. It is not that they're being disrespectful. And the way I word it for moms to get the idea, I say, how many times have you walked into a room to get something, and when you got there, you stopped and you stood, and you knew you were there for a purpose, but you no longer had a clue what it was? Okay, if you're struggling with that, are you surprised at all that your child may also struggle with truly forgetting what they're doing sometimes? And I'm thinking, you know, you may send your child off to go do something, and time goes on and time goes on, and you're thinking, well, golly, what's going on here? And, you know, and next thing you know, 45 minutes has gone by, and you're like, where is that boy? So here's what he did. He went off to his room to go get something that you told him to go get, and when he got there, he stopped, and he stood, and he knew he was there for a purpose, but he couldn't remember what it was, and then he saw his Legos, and it didn't matter anymore. So off he goes. So I have come up with ways to help remind this child when they are off independently, and this would be for chores or running off on a task to get something. For example, one of the things I've done is I created this really annoying thing that would go on their wrist. It was with a real loose kind of hairband, but it had this long strip of paper on it that I laminated, and then I would write on it the task of what it is they're supposed to go and do. Now this thing is really annoying, and the rule in the house is you don't get to take it off. You can only take this off if you've come back to me and I remove it and you tell me that you did the task. So it's that kind of thing you can do to help them remember until they're old enough to start having those memory devices for themselves where they help themselves to remember what it is they're doing.
Wow, that is actually that's a rebuke to me. I wouldn't consider that I have any highly distractible children in the way of which you are speaking. Mm-hmm. But I really don't give any grace for the just forgetfulness that even I struggle with. So I appreciate that reminder and great rebuke for me. Now, I've heard you say before that there was something that you were afraid to admit about your son for a while, afraid to talk about whatnot. What was that, and will you address it for us here?
Yeah, it's true. It ends up being kind of funny, but my son fell out of his chair a lot. And I mean, I would be working away, and it got to the point where I would hear that kerthunk, and I wouldn't even look over anymore because, I mean, I knew he'd just be sitting there on the floor again. And he just would move constantly while sitting in the chair. So I would be sitting there teaching to his face, and before you know it, he's upside down, and I'm teaching to his rear end. So this child never sat still. And so I remember thinking, you know, maybe there's something wrong with him neurologically. I don't know. So one of the times I was speaking, I finally had the courage to ask, and I said to the audience, all right, I just need to know. I need to know, how many of you have children who fall out of their chairs a great deal? And here was my shocker. 2/3 of the room raised their hand. And I now ask this question at every single talk where I talk about the distractible child, because consistently 2/3 of the room raises their hand. And I make them keep the hands up and look around because they were afraid to admit it for themselves. They thought their kid was the only one going through this. I don't know what it's about, but it is one of the most common things amongst Sizzlers. They fall out of their chairs a lot.
Well, you know, with the active children and with the highly distractible and so on, I was asked a question. I was talking to a young mother over Thanksgiving, and one thing that she said really gripped my heart, and I have not forgotten it. She was talking about her young daughter, who is probably ADHD. They're still trying to figure out, but what the mom said was that her daughter is the single biggest stressor in their marriage. And that just, it broke my heart on a lot of levels. And so I would like for you to address it, because if that is a struggle in her marriage, she's not alone in that either. So what would you say to a family that this trying to deal with and figure out these distractible children is becoming a problem in their marriage?
She needs to know, first of all, that she's not alone. That's really, really common. And it's common not just with ADHD kids, but any child who has some kind of physical or emotional struggles. And the first time I was aware of this, when my first child was born, he had a surgery within 36 hours. And then he had a total of 13 surgeries before he was 3.5. So we had a really difficult time with him physically, a lot of challenges. It was a very, very painful time. And one of the things that one of the hospitals did was they took the parents aside and had kind of a support group, and they said, you need to know what the odds are now for your marriage. And it was something horrendous. I mean, I seem to remember it being something like 90% of marriages with a special needs child will end in divorce. And so we knew right then and there we had to shore ourselves up in ways that perhaps we wouldn't have had to otherwise. And so it means, I know people hear this all the time, but it means having those date nights and getting out together. It does. It also means that you have to stop caring what other people think about how you deal with your child. You got to let that go, because if you want them to, I mean, there's so many times when people would turn to one of my kids and go, why do they do that, and that wasn't exactly a shining moment, for a mom. You want them to look at your kid and go, oh, that's so impressive, you're such a great mom. That's what you really want. But instead you kind of get these odd looks, and so you would try to make them understand, and you would try to explain, and you would try, and I finally got to a point where I no longer needed them to understand or approve. I no longer needed it. And it was enough for me that my husband and I were doing what we thought was best. And if they got it, great. And if they didn't, okay. I don't need them to approve or understand why we homeschool or why we're doing the things with my child that we're doing. And I think that was one of the biggest stress relievers, when I stopped caring what other people thought and just thought, all I have to do is what's best for my child. But I also think that's exactly why I started Sizzlebop, because you feel like you're alone. And if you go even to a lovely, supportive, local support group meeting of homeschoolers, chances are one or two other families has a kid like yours, and the rest of them, God bless them, don't get them. And they'll be the first ones to take you aside and go, I think that's sin. And they have no clue what they're talking about, and they're trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to help you out. But I knew that we moms of these distractible kids needed each other, and that's why I started Sizzlebop in 2004. And now we've got like over 5,000 moms who homeschool kids like this, and we have a community, and we know that we're not alone. And that's probably been the single most helpful thing, I think, for a lot of us, that we found each other.
Wow. Well, one of the things that that David and I really wanted to do when we first started Teach Them Diligently was offer a wide variety of workshops and sessions and so on for families with special needs children, because of that. Because we could tell that there was such a need, not just for the equipping, but for the encouragement and fellowship of being with other people. So every year that group has gotten bigger, and it's been so good to see so many of them in the house and to hear the testimonies as they have left. We are really quickly running out of time and have so much more to cover. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit. I know you've spoken on Focus on the Family, 50, 60, 70, 1,000 times, I don't know. But do you just talk about homeschooling? Do you just talk about distractible children? What all do you cover there?
In the beginning, I think it was a little bit more about homeschooling and such, but they just got to the point where they're like, oh, whatever you want to talk about. And so every year I go there and typically record like 12 recordings that they use throughout the year, and they've let me talk about all kinds of things, certainly learning styles and educational things, but I mean, one of them I talked about the time I was asked to be a Titus woman in our church, and I was horrified because, the Titus woman, the scripture reads something like, let the older women of your church come alongside the young women. And I'm just horrified because I didn't know I was the older woman, and here I was being asked to lead this program. And I thought, Titus, it rhymes with phlebitis, and I think we should be suspect of this right off the bat. So anyway, I can talk about all kinds of crazy things that deal with, being a Christian woman and sometimes dealing with ADHD kids, and I don't know, they've just let me cover all kinds of things. But most recently, they had me as a guest on their daily show to talk about my own prodigal years, because a lot of folks don't know this, but I'm the daughter of a pastor, and I became an atheist for a very long time. I was a very active atheist, and so they've allowed me to come on their main show, actually a 2-day program, to talk about that and what I learned that can help parents who have a child who's struggling with the faith.
Wow. And we also have you speaking on that topic at Teach Them Diligently as well, because you have the research coming out about how many people are leaving the church, how many of our children are, And we have to be willing to acknowledge that it's happening and get some counsel and some guidance. What can you tell us just in a nutshell that would be helpful, and maybe let people know why they would want to come hear that session about the prodigal?
The main thing I'm going to share with people in that session are ways to maintain a bridge with that child as they take what may be a long journey, so that when they lift their head up one day and they want to look for a connection to something that has meaning, will they look back home? You've got to have a bridge for that to happen.
Well, Carol, we are out of time, and I so appreciate your coming and hanging out with us. I appreciate your heart. I am so excited for everyone to get to hear you. So would you have any final thoughts for us to kind of tie it all together, and what you really want people to come to Teach Them Diligently and hear and leave with?
I'll tell you what I think I do is I have a party gift, I think, that I give to people who come to hear me, because sometimes you go to hear homeschool speakers, and especially when I began homeschooling 20 years ago, and they were so polished and lovely and all pulled together, and sometimes I would look at them and I think, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can homeschool. I can never be like that. But if you come to my session, along with getting lots and lots of ideas to use, you will listen to me speak and you will go away thinking, if that woman can homeschool, I know I can do this. And I think that's a little gift. So hopefully you'll come.
Well, Carol, thank you so much. If you are out there and you have more questions for Carol, go to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/teachthemdiligently. Leave your questions. Carol has been so gracious as to offer to come by and answer those there as well. And then just sign up, plan to come and see her. We will be in Nashville, Tennessee, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., and Dallas, Texas this year. And all of the information is on our website, which is teachthemdiligently.net. And before we go, Carol, I would like for you to tell them how they can find out your information, your website, what they can expect to see there.
I came prepared for that one. Hopefully you can see this. If you can go to Sizzlebop.com or carolbarnier.com, either one of those will help you connect to me, and I can, you can email me and we'll chat.
Well, thank you again. Thanks to everyone for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.